Okay, let's learn about the zones of regulation. Lots of schools use this program. It's a really successful program for giving a tangible visual to help kids identify how they're feeling in their bodies and then identify an appropriate course of action for dealing with that, usually some sensory based intervention. So, what you need to know about the basics of the zones of regulation is that there are 4 zones and they are color coordinated, which, as a former graphic designer, I love color coordination. So, if your student does have some sort of color blindness, keep that in mind that it may need to be modified. The first zone is the blue zone. This is to represent low registration, low energy, um, needing to be woken up. So, this zone is very often associated with feeling sad or bored or sick or just anything that has somebody not feeling up to doing much. Pretty much think of every teenager you know in their 8 a.m. class. Then we have the green zone. This is considered the ideal zone for learning. A lot of kids, when we explain this part of the program to them, especially if they're younger kids, will understand that green is good and then generalize that all the others must be bad. So they sometimes don't want to admit or recognize that they might be in a different zone because they know the right answer is that they're in the green zone. So be aware of this and don't try to emphasize too much how they need to be in green to start. The focus should be on green eventually. That is the end goal, but it's totally okay to maybe be in yellow or blue to start off with. So in green, this is where kids are happy, but not to the point of silly and goofy. So many of our pleasurable emotions we tend to put here. Then we have yellow. This is where a child is starting to get a little bit out of control. They might be silly and goofy, as I mentioned before. They might be kind of embarrassed and pulling back. They might be agitated by a classmate. They're not out of control, but they're kind of headed in a direction of, I am not quite in a place to learn because something has me going. For kids with sensory issues, it just may be that they need input, that they haven't gotten enough yet. And so they're just not green and they're kind of sensory seeking. Then we have the red zone. This is the kids who are throwing chairs, stomping their feet, screaming, angry. They are obviously not ready to learn. They are probably so upset that they can't even rationalize their zone right now. And that's okay. And we as adults need to recognize that someone truly in the red zone is probably not going to be able to work with the zones of regulation right now. But it's really important that we still teach this zone because once the child has de escalated and calmed down, we can do some education about that's what red looks like. And before we get to red, what are some things we can do? And that's a lot of strategies that maybe school counselors and OTs and teachers may be doing with your child if they're doing the zones of regulation. For a lot of younger kids or kids with challenges that make it difficult for them to understand emotion, the basics of the system are very emotion identifying, intense, because this is also a tool to help kids learn those emotions. You know, get into a general category like blue or yellow, and then break it down from there. Some kids need it a bit more concrete, so we will sometimes identify these behaviors: stomping out of the classroom, eloping, shouting, spitting in your chair and running around the room. These are associated with these zones. So we might ask the child to look at their behavior and then identify if that is a green zone behavior or a yellow zone behavior, and have them identify their zone that way. And then the next step would be teaching them to then break it down into what emotion under that zone. Very much like an emotion wheel, if you've ever used one of those, where it starts off pretty broad and general, and then you break it down into more and more specific emotions and emotional language. So once a child can identify their zone, then the next step is that they identify an appropriate activity or strategy for getting them closer to green if they're not already there. If a child has sensory issues, this usually involves a sensory strategy. If the child's struggles are more behavioral, it can involve more behavioral strategies. And obviously, if they're a pretty good mix of both, it will probably include both. I would say that for most kids, it should probably include a bit of both, because we all have different reasons for going off into the different zones. And it might even vary within the same kid from situation to situation. So if a child is blue and they are sleepy and can't focus, we usually need to use a sensory strategy that will wake them up, or at least wake up their nervous system, wake up their body. So typically these can be spinning activities, inversion activities, which means their head goes down towards their feet and back up. So things where they go, upside down, or they go on a swing and kind of lean back, or they go on a sit and spin and they get to twirl, or a swing that twirls, or maybe there's a motor pathway in the school and they get to do some stuff where they're crossing midline and reaching from one side of their body to the other. So anything that gets them some movement that's going to wake them up, and that will move them towards green zone. If they are green, they're optimal. We don't really need to use a strategy, except we may, especially if they are a highly sensory needs kid, we might want to provide them continual sensory activities to keep them in that green zone, especially if they need a lot to stay there. Then we have the yellow. This gets a little bit more complex because it's going to vary on the kid. Typically, when a kid is yellow and very active, we need a calming strategy. This might be weighted vests. This might be dimming the lights. However, some kids that present as yellow zone are really just extremely blue, but their behavior looks like yellow. These are a lot of your kids with ADHD or are highly sensory seeking. They didn't get enough input yet today, and they are craving it because their body needs that level of input to stay alert and ready for learning. So in that case, we need to give this child intense sensory, like you would for a blue zone kid. Now, to figure out where your kid is in there, work with your child's occupational therapist. They will best be able to give you ideas to trial and help you record it properly so that you can see the pattern over time of what your child generally needs. Now, red zone kids, remember, these are the kids that are throwing books and tearing things up, and they have lost it. Typically, space, calming strategies are what these kids need. They are not in a position right now to rationalize their behavior or have a discussion about their behavior. They are just too far gone and they are flipping out. Dim the lights. Try not to talk more than necessary. If you do have to talk, make it simple, make it short, and wait for them to start calming down. Maybe they have a sensory tool like a weighted blanket or something that helps when they're in this situation. Again, work with your child's provider to figure out what strategies are going to work for your kid and for the realities of your environment and what you can do. So once a kid understands the zones and what their strategies are for each zone, the final step is to get your child independent to where they can recognize that they are going away from green in whatever direction and self-start one of the activities to keep them green. We see this all the time with adults. They might be a person that tends to run bluish. So we see them chewing gum or fidgeting with a pencil during a meeting or spinning in their chair. We do that because we're bored, but we're trying to stay alert because we know we have to pay attention. And so automatically we've developed our own little systems for increasing that stimulation to keep ourselves alert. We know that when we're upset about something and getting ready to lose it, that taking ourselves out of the room and going for a walk outside and some deep breaths can calm us down and naturally bring us down to green. So we all use the zones of regulation. Sometimes we just have kids that need a little extra assistance to do that because they can't do it so much naturally. Most kids, especially young ones, can't do it naturally, and this is part of education about themselves and how their bodies work. So if you have any other questions about the zones of regulation, please feel free to visit their official website, talk with your child's occupational therapist, or leave your questions in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell if you want to get notifications for when I put new videos up.